Welcome. This is Orthodox Christian Television. I'm the host for this week. My name is Father Christodolos. We have a special guest with us today. His name is Dr. Miljan Peter Illich, who is a professor of history, and his specialty is the Balkans and the island of Cyprus. Welcome, Dr. Illich.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you. We are going to discuss, Peter and I, Dr. Illich, the history of the island of Cyprus. And recently, Americans will have heard of Cyprus in the news, but they still might not know where Cyprus is. It's an island in the eastern Mediterranean, several hundred miles off of the coast of Israel, south of Turkey, and several hundred miles east of Greece, or Crete, the southernmost island in Greece. Cyprus has a long and varied history. It's an island that's been disputed by various different conquerors, but predominantly, I would say, I'm not a historian, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that predominantly throughout its history, Cyprus has had a Greek presence and an Orthodox Christian presence.
That's accurate, and as far as Orthodox Christian presence goes, only since the founding of Christianity. Before that, it wasn't there.
Of course not, but before that, if it wasn't Orthodox, then it was predominantly
It was
Greek
predominantly Greek religion, beliefs in the Greek gods, and so on.
Okay. Now, the reason I bring up the Greekness or Orthodoxness of Cyprus is because right now there is a power in the area that's disputing the right of Greeks or Orthodox Christians to have any kind of hegemony or rights, a nationhood of Cyprus with a predominantly Greek government or predominantly Orthodox government and population. Turkey is now occupying 1/3 of the island, an illegal occupation that's been condemned by the United Nations, by several United Nations resolutions. The invasion occurred in 1974, and the occupation still is in effect. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is just to give the viewers a recent historical background to the island of Cyprus. Cyprus is an independent nation. It's not a part of Greece. It's not a part of Turkey. It's an independent nation. It's a republic, but 1/3 of it is occupied by a foreign country, which is called Turkey. But let's go back. Let's go back before there even were Turks. Let's go back to when there were Greeks, and when the first people who settled Cyprus may not have even been Greeks. Who were the first actual human beings that we know to have stepped foot on Cyprus and had left any kind of a trace?
Well, there was an ancient culture on Cyprus, which really we know nothing about them because they had no writing, they had no script, they didn't build too much. It was a prehistoric culture. But by about 1200 BC, the main population of the inhabitants of Cyprus was set, and these were predominantly Greek population which came into Cyprus and settled by 1000 BC. It was mostly Greek, and in fact, according to legend, many of the settlers in Cyprus were Greek veterans of the Trojan War, who after the Trojan War settled in Cyprus and established Greek civilization in Cyprus.
Interesting. So they weren't Trojans, they were Greeks.
They were Greeks. They were actually from the Greek side in the Trojan War.
Okay. And this is roughly 1000 BC.
About 1000 BC.
And
right.
have they left traces? Have these?
Oh yes, quite a few. There are quite a few traces left, and it was established. They started building temples and developed. There was a script which was developed for trading purposes.
Could we say that script was a Greek script, or was it a predecessor?
It was a predecessor of the Greek script. I would say it was a cross between a Greek script and the Phoenician script. Okay. It was something in between the two of them.
So we wouldn't be able to call it. Could we say it's distinctly? It was a distinctly Greek language and script that they were using.
It was a distinctly Greek language, but the script was a combination of Greco-Phoenician.
Okay, so the Greeks were finding their alphabet, so to say.
They were developing the Greek alphabet.
Now, when the Trojans veterans of the Trojan War,
the Greek veterans of the Trojan War,
veterans of the Trojan War arrived in Cyprus, they found some indigenous people there, which
relatively few, really. There weren't that many, and those people were really pretty easily merged into the overwhelming waves of Greek immigration which came to Cyprus for the first couple hundred years around the year 1000 BC.
So they most likely were absorbed into the population?
Basically, they were absorbed.
Became Greeks?
Basically, they were, you might say, Hellenized.
Hellenized, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
that's about the years 1000 BC. Now let's move up a little bit and try and get into towards the classical era, which is more familiar to our audience, the Greek classical era. What role did Greek civilization play in relation to Cyprus during the classic era? Or what role did Cyprus play during Greece's classical era?
Well, Cyprus was invaded from 800 BC until about 500 BC. It was invaded by a succession of powers. It was invaded, there were Phoenician settlements, and two major Phoenician settlements took root in Cyprus and remained there as small Phoenician kingdoms for several hundred years. There were invasions by Assyrians, there were invasions by Egyptians, there were a number of major invasions, but still the predominant character of the people remained Greek until all the way to the classical period.
So even though these several different conquerors invaded Cyprus, the people of the island retained their Greek character.
For the most part, the overwhelming majority, they retain a Greek character. In fact, a notable example of that was during the Persian occupation of Cyprus, around 400 BC, Evagorus, who was Greek, and king of Salamis, led the major revolt against the Persians, and for a while gained independence for the bulk of Cyprus and made Cyprus into a center of Greek culture, classical Greek culture, learning, the arts. They built Greek temples. They developed scholars.
You mentioned something that may be getting the attention of some of our viewers, that Egypt invaded Cyprus.
Egypt briefly invaded Cyprus.
Martin Barnell has claimed that the Egyptians invaded all of Greece, and in fact, this is why the Greek civilization was so advanced. It was because they were invaded by the Egyptians and became basically Egyptians or stole Egyptian ideas. So they actually set foot in Cyprus.
Well, they did, but however, let me explain that. It was around 600 BC, and it was in Egypt, which was already under a very considerable degree of influence by Greek culture.
Egypt was.
Egypt
when
was
it
already
invaded Cyprus.
The one that invaded Cyprus was already highly influenced by Greek culture. They used to invade Cyprus. They used a navy which was built for them by Greek technicians and sailed by Greek officers. So it was an Egypt which was not ancient Egypt as Bernal would say, but it was an Egypt which was under Greek influence and using Greek technology, and it was a very brief occupation.
And this is long before Alexander and his Macedonians completely Hellenized Egypt.
That's right.
So the Hellenizing of Egypt, in other words, Egypt was softened to Hellenism already by some previous Greeks.
It was. There was a very large, by around 600 BC, there was a very large Greek element in Egypt. There was a city called now Crete, which was overwhelmingly Greek. The Greek pharaoh Psammetichus was a friend of Greeks, and he invited Greek scholars already into Egypt and Greek technicians.
And they had sort of like their own ghetto, so as we would say.
Well, I wouldn't say a ghetto. There were entire cities. There was a couple of cities which were largely populated by Greeks in Egypt by the time that Cyprus was invaded.
And then maybe what gave them the idea to invade Cyprus? Was it these wonderful Greeks that they saw living amongst them, and they said, well, let's go get more Greeks?
Well, basically, it was
Cyprus?
strategic. It was strategic. They saw Cyprus as a base for operations against enemy powers, such as the rising power of Syria. And it was a strategic occupation which was extremely brief, and really didn't leave too much of a trace on Cypriot history.
Okay, now this is about 600 BC.
Approximately 600 BC, there were.
Did any of
by
these cities?
600 BC, there was a couple of brief Egyptian occupations of Cyprus.
During these invasions by the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Persians, was Hellenism in any way spread back to these areas like Persia, Syria, in the Middle East because of these invasions? Was this the first contact that some of these cultures had with Hellenism?
No, they all had contact with Hellenism previously, but I don't see too much of Hellenism being spread from Cyprus itself. It was spread from the mainland of Greece and from Asia Minor and other Greek settlements there.
Okay. So who was the final invader of Cyprus before the classical period?
Well, the final invader were the Persians. And the revolt of Evagoras was against the Persians, and he achieved independence for much of Cyprus against the Persians for a while until he was defeated. And then afterwards, 333 BC, Alexander the Great invaded Asia.
But he wasn't Greek, he was a Macedonian.
Well, he was Greek, Macedonian.
Of course he was.
And Cyprus, all the kings of Cyprus, there were 10 kings of Cyprus at that time, and all of them joined Alexander the Great, including the two who were still considering themselves basically Phoenician. They joined Alexander the Great, and they sent forces to help him in his wars, and he officially recognized Cyprus as autonomous, as he recognized the kings as independent, and this remained in effect for a short time until the Ptolemaic dynasty took Egypt, 323 BC, and the Ptolemies actually made Cyprus part of the Ptolemaic Empire. So Cyprus was for about close to 300 years part of the Egyptian Empire, but it was the Greek Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt. That was the only long period of Egyptian rule in Cyprus.
But the rulers of Egypt at that time happened to be Greeks.
Well, they were all Greeks, yes, definitely.
From Macedonia. Okay. So the 10 kings that you mentioned that allied themselves with Alexander means that there were 10 little kingdoms in Cyprus.
There were 10 little kingdoms in Cyprus at that time.
And several of these kingdoms were Phoenician kingdoms.
Two were Phoenician.
2 out of the 10.
2 out of 10 were Phoenician. 8 identified themselves as purely Greek.
Interesting. And did the Phoenician kingdoms in Cyprus ever fight with the Greek kingdoms?
Occasionally, but there were minor wars. These were really very small kingdoms.
Well,
as you can imagine, Cyprus has less than 4,000 square miles.
Can we compare the size of Cyprus to an American island so our viewers may have an idea of how large Cyprus is or how small it is? So compared to Long Island?
I would say it's several times the size of, about twice the size of Long Island.
Twice the size of Long Island, okay. So we divide up Long Island, twice the size of Long Island, to 10 little kingdoms. You can see how small these kingdoms are.
Yeah, each one will be a few hundred square miles,
really
basically.
More like, okay.
They're more like city-states than real kingdoms. They call themselves kingdoms.
Now, did Alexander ever step foot on Cyprus?
Not as far as we know. He never stepped foot.
I guess he didn't need to. It was a little backwater for him.
Yeah, it was a minor thing, and he didn't conquer Cyprus. The Cypriot kings joined Alexander. As soon as they saw the rise of Alexander, they rushed to join him and joined forces with him and accepted his suzerainty.
Maybe I shouldn't have used the word backwater. I mean, at this time, Cyprus had a very advanced culture and
definitely an advanced culture.
Wine manufacturing.
Well, wine, and also, of course, well, the main industry was copper. In fact, copper. The word copper comes from Cyprus, the name for Cyprus, because
Greek word, Kypros.
Yeah. Cyprus was the main copper center and the source of copper for all of Europe for many centuries.
The kings who allied themselves with Alexander fought with him. Did they actually join him and send troops?
They all sent some aid of different kinds. Some of them actually joined them in the conquest of Asia, but not all of them.
Okay. Let's move on a little bit in history. Let's move the clock ahead. Let's go to the, we talked about the Ptolemies, the Greek Macedonians who came and conquered Egypt and joined Cyprus to Egypt, so that the general Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander's generals, became pharaoh at when Alexander died. Alexander divided up his kingdom, and his generals became little kings of the areas that Alexander conquered. Correct me if I'm making any mistakes. And Ptolemy, his general, became pharaoh of Egypt and took Cyprus into his kingdom.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Now let's continue with this history of Cyprus after the Ptolemies.
58 BC, Cyprus was annexed by Rome, and the rise of the Roman Republic, so the expansion of Roman power, And it was taken by Rome in a way as payment for a huge debt. The Ptolemies had borrowed money from Rome, and Rome just decided to take Cyprus in
payment.
In payment, more or less. Eventually, they took all of Egypt. Eventually, the Roman
They took
Empire.
all of Greece eventually.
In Greece, Egypt, and practically all of Europe.
And then they became Greeks, as we know.
But 58 BC, Cyprus became part of the Roman Empire, which essentially remained for quite a few centuries.
Now, the Roman Empire, let's talk about the Roman Empire for a minute, because Cyprus was one of the important islands in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire stretched all the way from Britain to the gates of Persia, from southern Germany to Africa.
North Africa.
And its culture was predominantly...
Into Ethiopia, actually.
I'm getting a signal. 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 15 minutes, okay. Yeah, 15 minutes, good. We're only halfway, so we have plenty of time to talk.
Let's go.
The culture of Rome was a predominantly what kind of culture?
Well,
Greek, Roman, Italian, Spanish, what was it?
Well, it was, you might call it a Latin culture built on the basis of Greek learning and Greek civilization, which the Romans gave a particular development to a basically Greek culture.
So it was a Greco-Roman world.
I would say it was definitely a Greco-Roman world, and in fact, the Romans, even before they became a real power, they sent emissaries and they sent students to Athens and statesmen to Greece to study Greek learning, to study Greek ways of ruling a country, and to learn from the Greeks, and they learned very well, and they added a lot. Basically, I would say the Romans developed a lot of Greek practical knowledge and governmental skills and applied them on a very wide scale.
And we're able to do one thing that the Greeks weren't able to do, which was to unify most of the known world.
That's right.
Under one political system.
The Greeks were never really even able to unify Greece for long in classical times.
Okay, and maybe that was part of their strength, but that's another discussion.
Well, that's, in a way, it was part of their strength, but
on the next program we'll talk about that.
It was also a weakness.
Okay. Now, let's go back to Cyprus. During the Roman period, what was Cyprus like during the Roman period? Did it get Latinized in any way, or did it remain
during the Roman period, Cyprus was administered as part of the Roman Empire, and basically it became Latinized in the governmental structure, but the average people and most of the population were basically Greek. And in fact, one interesting thing about the Roman period in Cyprus was that in approximately 46 AD, we have St. Paul went to Cyprus, and he actually, according to the Bible, there's an indication in there that he converted the Roman governor of Cyprus, Sergius Paulus.
Right.
And so you might say that Cyprus became the first area in the world that was ruled by a Christian or administered by Christians.
That claim is usually made by the Armenians.
Well, there is evidence that it was actually Cyprus that was the first one.
Well, let's discuss that for a minute. What was the first kingdom, or the first political entity to be Christianized?
Well, as far as I'm saying, for an independent kingdom, it's different, but just for a large administrative unit, a province, I think Cyprus would get the credit for that.
Okay, so it wasn't an independent kingdom.
No, it was not. It was not
independent at all.
It was a Roman province, but it was actually in the Roman Empire. It was the first major administrative unit of the Roman Empire to be ruled by a Christian governor.
And this first Christian governor's name again?
Sergius Paulus.
Sergius Paulus.
Paulus.
Okay.
Paulus.
So. This is what year now, so we can keep our timeline.
Well, approximately 50 AD.
Okay. Now, let's skip, because we have to cover a lot of history in about 13 minutes. So let's skip ahead now to the Roman Empire, of course, in the East. The Roman Empire fell in 1453, as most people don't know.
Right.
But in the West, it fell in different periods piecemeal. So we really don't have a date officially when the Roman Empire fell. So. In the West. So we can say in 1453 is when it finally, Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire, finally fell. But Cyprus was not a part of the Roman Empire from the time of the first Christian governor that St. Paul converted until the fall of Constantinople, was it? There were
No, it
periods
wasn't.
when Cyprus came into the explain that a little bit.
Well, it was a very interesting period of time for Cyprus.
It's a long period of time.
A long period of
1,400
time.
years.
Well, yes, and there was such diversity of powers that came into Cyprus. Cyprus was always like a magnet for different powers trying to conquer it. Even today, different cultures, different civilizations were drawn to Cyprus. About 395 AD, basically there was a division of the Roman Empire into East and West. Cyprus was administered from the east, from the main center of the Roman Empire, which was Constantinople. And it remained like that for a while. But then in the early 7th century, Islam was developed by the Arabs, and within 100 years, Islam was an extremely powerful force sweeping through the world. Among the first areas outside of Arabia to feel the effect of Islam in Europe was Cyprus. Around 650 AD, there was a major invasion of Cyprus by a fleet of 1,000 ships led by the Emir of Syria.
What year is 650?
About 650, only about 20 years after Muhammad is considered to have established the Islamic faith in Arabia.
In this battle,
He actually conquered Cyprus.
it was more than a battle, it was a conquest.
It was a conquest of Cyprus, and
So
there was
the Roman fleet and the Roman armies, the garrisons were overwhelmed.
overwhelmed, and there were about 300 years in which Cyprus was there was a bone of contention between the Roman Empire led by Constantinople and different Arabic invaders. And they were constantly sweeping through Cyprus for 300 years, looting and destroying the developing wealth and civilization that was the result of the Greco-Roman period.
Of course, by this time, Cyprus was a Christian island.
It was a Christian island completely by this time, and it was predominantly Orthodox.
Well, Orthodoxy was basically the entire church at that time. There was no Frankish church yet.
Not yet, but that was to come.
Yes, the Latin heresy hadn't reared its ugly head yet, but the 300 years that the Arabs were contending for Cyprus,
On and off.
On and off. In other words, the Romans the Christians would knock them out,
And
off
they would
the
come
island,
back
and they would
in
come
there.
back. Now, this period, there's a question I want to ask you about this. During these conquests of Cyprus by the Muslims, these were Arabic
These were
Muslims?
predominantly Arabic Muslims.
These Arabic Muslims, did they change the Christian character of the island?
No, really, they did not. If anything, they made the island even more determined to be Christian. Because
How so?
Well, because the Arabs were, well, to use an old word, pretty barbaric in what they did. Basically, contrary to Spain, where the Arabs established civilization, Cyprus was seen as, for the most part, a place to loot, take slaves, to take the wealth of the island.
Then. Why
to
was
burn and
Cyprus seen,
pillage.
why was Cyprus seen as a place to rape, pillage, destroy, loot, and southern Spain wasn't?
The only explanation I can come to about that is the fact that Cyprus was more fiercely resisted by the Byzantine and others,
Roman.
Christians, Romans. They never really
I
accepted
just wanted to
it.
correct you there. Byzantine, so that we don't confuse the audience. Byzantine is really Roman and Byzantine. Byzantine is a term for the eastern half of the Roman Empire.
That's how I was using
Right.
it.
They never called themselves Byzantines.
But
the
it was
Romans.
right. It was
Well, let's refer to them that way.
Cyprus was
They-
controlled by the eastern half of the Roman Empire
Okay.
ever since 395
ever since right.
AD.
Okay.
So there was quite a bit of contention, and it was near the end of the 10th century actually. Constantinople succeeded in coming back to Cyprus, and the Arabs never came to Cyprus again in any major way, except for occasional raids here and there. But it became solidly established as part of the empire again for about 200 years,
In the
until
Go ahead.
until 1191.
What happened in 1191?
1191, we had the Third Crusade was on the way.
On the way to...
On the way to Palestine to try to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims.
Okay.
And Richard the Lionhearted was sailing towards Palestine with a large English fleet, and Cyprus was ruled by Isaac Comnenus, who had been a governor under the authority of Constantinople, but who rebelled against the emperors of Constantinople and made himself an emperor of Cyprus.
Interesting. So he was a rebel against Rome.
He was a rebel, and he was very unpopular in Cyprus.
He was an unpopular dictator.
He was an unpopular dictator.
And he happened to find himself fighting against the English.
He was the ruler of Cyprus. Several of Richard's ships were shipwrecked in Cyprus, and men under the command of Isaac Comnenus looted those ships. His fiancée, Berengaria, his sister Joanna...
Whose fiancée?
Richard the Lionhearted's fiancée, Berengaria, his sister Joanna, and according to some accounts, his mother, but definitely the first two, try to get water and food from Isaac, but he refused them.
I've been told we only have 1 minute left.
Oh, wow.
In other words, a Christian island was invaded by a Christian fleet, and the excuse was that you looted my ships, you desecrated my fiancée.
Well, he refused to, Richard, actually, it is true, he refused to give food and water and supplies to his fiancée and Richard's sister. He looted his ships, and Richard invaded Cyprus, and he conquered very quickly. And according to some accounts, even the population of Cyprus welcomed him. Cyprus. Neophytus, who was an Orthodox monk, wrote a history of Cyprus around the year 1200.
That's where we're going to take it up on our next program from there, because we're out of time. And I want to thank you, Dr. Illich, for coming in and sharing some of your knowledge with us. And please come back so we can finish this history of Cyprus, the European island of Cyprus. And thank you for watching Orthodox Christian Television.